In this video, we're going to talk about how to protect personal assets when starting a business. Now, this is especially important since there's enough at stake just starting a business. You know the statistics. We don't want to add to that and make it even more dangerous. In this video, you'll learn the risks to identify when starting a business. You're going to see how risk is determined and how it's evaluated. You'll learn why most people get it wrong when determining their risk. I'll show you why supposed limited liability may not really be limited. We'll take a look at the concept of calculated risk. You'll learn the truth about limited liability. You'll learn the most essential step to take when starting your business. I'll share with you the most important word that you need to understand, that you must understand when starting a business to protect your assets. And stick with me to the end because I've got a free gift for you. Starting a business has certain inherent costs. We know all the details, all the statistics where you hear about 80% of all businesses fail in the first 5 years. Of those that survive, 80% of those fail in the next 5 years, different things like that. You've heard them, you know the risk, but guess what? It still has tremendous benefits when you can start your own business, control your destiny, and basically write your own ticket. That's why you do it. That's the dream. Well, that dream can become a nightmare if you haven't done it the right way. We understand that there are certain risks. That's just part of it. The reality is we don't want to increase those risks by not properly structuring ourselves right from the very beginning. Now, one of the things that people think about is that I want to make sure that I have limited liability. But what does this mean? I think about it like this. A lot of times when you're looking at a certain type of business, let's say that I wanted to start a business investing in the stock market. Well, I may say, you know what, I want to be a day trader, so I'm going to set aside $100,000 and I'm going to turn this $100,000 into $1 million plus. Well, that's a great business idea, but let's think about the risk. Your biggest risk there is that you'll lose your $100,000. Well, that's with that type of business. Think about other types of business. What if I say I'm going to take my $100,000 and I'm going to buy a rent house? And hopefully that's going to appreciate so I get some increased net worth, and at the same time I'm going to have some cash flow. That sounds great. Well, is your risk $100,000 or is it much more? Let's think about that. Because of the nature of that asset, you have more at risk. What if somebody sues you? What if somebody's working on the property? What if there's a tenant and they slip and fall on the property? What if something happens, now they sue you? Well, you've got a lot more at risk than just $100,000. That determines, is it really limited liability? So continuing on that concept, one of the things that I've seen people do on a pretty regular basis is that they'll set aside a certain amount of money because they say, okay, I'm willing to put this much at risk, but I don't want any more risk than that. So maybe they'll set aside, $50,000, $100,000, $250,000, whatever it might be, that they say, okay, what can I stand to lose? Well, that's great, and we recognize that because that's somewhat of a calculated risk, but at the same time, it could be much greater than that, especially when we're talking about lawsuits. So when we're talking about protecting personal assets, what many people mistakenly believe is that as long as I keep this money separate, then it won't get into my personal bank account. It won't affect my personal assets. Well, if it comes to a lawsuit, if you don't have the right structure in place, you're not going to have that limited liability protection because your personal assets will be at risk. Just because you kept things separate, you didn't keep things separate legally. We've got to have a separate legal entity, and that's what we're going to be talking about in our next several points. Let's talk a little bit about that concept of calculated risk. I love calculated risk. It's one of my favorite concepts. When we talk about risk in general, I don't really love risk, but if it's calculated risk, it changes things. And certain risks can be calculated, but there are others that just simply can't. I gave the example earlier as far as if we set aside $100,000 to invest in the stock market, we can identify that the maximum we stand to lose is $100,000. Now, unless we're buying a margin or something like that, which increases the risk. But for the most part, what we're looking at is we have that calculated risk. We understand the threats. We don't have any interaction with people, which that's something that you definitely need to factor in, because anytime that there are two or more people, the likelihood of a conflict it's not even just a possibility, it's a probability. Well, that's something that we've got to factor in, and that's why we've got to have protection when we start a business, especially the type of business, and that's where you evaluate the calculated risk. Are you dealing with customers? Are you dealing with clients? Are you dealing with contractors? Those 3 C's right there can greatly increase your potential vulnerability and your potential liability. So we've got to make sure that that's calculated as part of this overall process. And now I want to talk to you about what I call the truth about limited liability. You see, a lot of times people think, no, you don't understand. I have a limited liability company, so I'm fine. Well, let's break that down for just a second. A limited liability company means your liability is limited to the entire company. Well, is that really limited? If all of your eggs are in that one basket, if something happens to that basket, what happens to your eggs? Now you've lost them. See, if you really want limited liability, you need to build an overall limited liability structure. Well, limited liability structure factors in what I refer to as isolation and insulation. What we are doing is we're dividing out different activities and different assets into different legal entities so that we can greatly limit that liability and provide greater limited liability protection. You see, one limited liability company is not enough because basically anytime somebody tells me that, what I heard them say is, no, you don't understand. I put all my eggs in one basket. Well, good for you. You may have saved a little bit of money, but you've probably cost yourself a lot more money because of what you didn't do than what you did do. So we've got to make sure that we understand that limited liability is not always limited. So if we understand that we've got to isolate and insulate, what that means is that we will ultimately have multiple legal entities. Now that may scare you because you start thinking about, oh my gosh, what about the multiple fees? Well, I would basically counteract that with, what about the multiple layers of protection? You see, think about this. You have set aside amounts of money. You've set aside time. You've sacrificed time with your family, with your friends, with other activities that you may love because you're pouring yourself into this business. You don't want to lose it all because you decided that you wanted to keep things simple. Well, here's what I want to make sure you understand. By implementing these additional entities, it's not difficult. It's just different. We've got to do things differently if we want to get different results. That's something that you basically have to understand, whether it's increasing your profitability or increasing your protection. Either way, if you want different results, you've got to do things differently. Okay, I told you I was going to share with you a special word. That word is separate. Now, I would use it a couple different ways. Number one, I would say separate. You need to separate your assets, separate your activities into separate legal entities. Now, the other thing is you've got to keep them separate. You can't be basically commingling funds. You've got to have separate bank accounts. You need separate identification numbers. You've got to have separate legal entities. And you've got to make sure that you keep these things separate. I share this story all the time. When I was growing up, my mother used to tell me, young man, if you want to be treated like an adult, you're going to have to act like an adult. I can't tell you how often I heard that. Maybe I heard it more than most people. I don't know. But maybe you need to hear this right now. If you want to get separate protection, you've got to keep your assets separate from one another. You've got to keep your activities separate from one another. And separate means separate. What that means for you is that, yes, you do need to have separate bank accounts. Yes, you do need separate legal entities. And yes, you need separate documentation. Once again, I promise you, it's not difficult, it's just different. Now, I cover these strategies and a lot more in something that I want to provide you absolutely free of charge. It's my mini course that I call Enlightened Asset Protection. And that's exactly what it's going to do for you. It's going to enlighten you on exactly what you need for your asset protection to protect those personal assets when starting a business. Now, to access that mini course, click the link below and you will be directed to take advantage of the entire course. I'm JJ Childers. Thanks so much for watching.